Hello, Internet. We've started the stream about only 8 minutes early this week, so if you're watching this after the fact, go ahead and fast forward. If not, just hang out and wait until 7 p.m. when we start the study. Oh, and we're going to do Exodus 17 and 18 today.
Yay.
Yay? What yay?
Can you put the 17?
Yes.
Yay. I probably could.
It's going to be a little bit wacky, too.
Yeah, it did take Velveeta to go.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm supposed to take a picture later because Jeff didn't do it at work. Me and my mask and my fanny pack. Apparently, my shoes and my fanny pack kind of went well together. But I got compliments on having my fanny pack ready for pencil or research or this.
It's kind of what you do.
Well, I didn't have it before we went to Only at Home, and it was really frustrating because I would set my stuff down and I would go to a different table because we're always floating, and I would never have the pencil or whatever that I needed because it was always at a different table and I had to find it, and it was just frustrating. So, as always, I find solutions because things frustrate me, and I don't want to be frustrated anymore. So on Sunday for finishing Romans, do you have a thought of where we're going to go next?
Nope. No clue.
And you still want to do 2 different books each week?
Yeah. I think it would cause problems to do the same book on 2 different days of the week.
I mean, if everything's online, then it won't be that bad. I know we were doing 2 different ones because not everybody came to both Sunday, Tuesday.
Yeah.
So yes, yeah, if somebody missed Sunday, we normally have Monday and parts of Tuesday to catch back up. That makes sense.
So we have 4 different supporting texts that we have to talk about during today's study. It's going to be a lot of bouncing back and forth. It's good to have a computer.
Hello.
Huh?
Your mom.
Oh.
Hello.
Hello.
Even though it's not very good reference, the Bible Gateway is really good about you going, I want this, comma, this, comma, this, comma, this, and I'll do like one window of everything you wanted.
Yeah. Bible Gateway is the one that seems to come up every time you search for a passage in Google.
Mm-hmm.
But what I like about Blue Letter is that if you try to jump from a passage to the other translations versions of that passage, and then try to get to like interlinears and other, interesting tools, those are organized really well in Blue Letter.
Okay.
Sometimes I like
I think Blue
interlinears.
Letter is more of a study,
Yeah.
whereas Bible Gateway is just more of a read through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But they do at least have the option where, like, if you have that little letter, you can click on it, it goes down,
Yeah.
does the thing, but then you can click to link back up to the verse that you were just at.
Yeah. I think the weakness of Blue Letter is the cross references. Because, in your text, you'll have the little notes that tell you what cross references with what.
Mm-hmm.
And it's usually pretty clear, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you'll just have a capital letter and it'll say, this is a quote from, Second Opinions chapter 2 or something, right? But if you try to look at cross references in Blue Letter, it's looking for instances of the actual words,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that becomes a problem in the New Testament, especially because the translation will say one thing that's oftentimes translated more heavily leaning on a Hebrew text, right? Leaning more heavily on the Hebrew text from the Masoretes in the Old Testament, right? But then in the New Testament, the gospel writers and the epistle writers tended to lean on the Septuagint, right? Plus, they'll take a passage and they'll slightly modify it in order to apply it to the gospel,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if you're looking up a cross-reference in Blue Letter based on a New Testament quotation of an Old Testament passage, because of the different source texts,
Mm-hmm.
right, Greek versus Hebrew, and because of the fact that they're sometimes repurposing,
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes it doesn't quickly and easily lead you back with the cross-reference tool to what you're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a paper Bible, it has it in there clearly.
Mm-hmm.
So should anyone from Blue Letter Bible ever give a crap about my opinions on their product, that's something they could improve. I don't know if it's easy to improve, but it's something that could be improved.
That sounds like a familiar statement from earlier this morning.
Yeah.
Don't go there.
No. And we just won't even explain to the internet what that was about. All right. So it is 7. It is time to get started on our text today. So we're in Genesis chapter 17 today. Exodus chapter 17 today. Well, Genesis was the last thing I searched for because it's one of our supporting texts. Actually, 2 of our supporting texts are from Genesis. So we're doing quite a lot of hopping today, specific to one particular person. Anyway, so in the story, where we're at is the Israelites have crossed the Red Sea, or the Reed Sea, or the sea that's at the end, depending on how exactly you're going to look at that particular translation. One way or another, though, they have escaped Egypt and Pharaoh's army, not by their own strength of, military might, but by the agency of God, right? That's probably the most important takeaway, is that when it came down to a confrontation between Pharaoh and God, God won, Pharaoh lost, right?
For a second, I thought you were going to say God 1, Pharaoh 0.
Same diff, yeah. And then on the heels of that great victory, they immediately start complaining about why isn't God taking care of us the way we want? And that's when the manna gets introduced and the quail, because they were complaining about meat. And we read how there was lots of Edenic language in the psalm, the song that they sang commemorating crossing the Red Sea, but also Edenic language talking about the camp that they ended up in, because they ended up in a place called Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, right? And taken all together, the passage is supposed to put readers in the mind of how this is like a cosmic reset, right? This is like a miniature act of creation for God's people, for God's nation, right? To say, here's a new beginning for you. I have ordained this place for you right here, and imposed order on wilderness. Makes sense? So in their thinking, that would have had strong ties back to the Genesis creation and all the things that were included there, hence the Edenic language, right? So after all of that, after all the manna stuff, right, the chapter ended in 16 with the instructions to save some of the manna for future generations, right? And a little bit of a puzzling verse about how the Israelites ate manna until they went into the promised land. And we talked a little bit about how that could possibly work with Mosaic authorship, because Moses can't write that because he's dead by then. So that's an example of an editorial comment that a later scribe almost certainly added in to explain the transition there, right? So that's because some kid's going to ask their parents, how come we don't eat manna now? Well, because, son, it lasted until this time. Makes sense? That sort of thing happens. All right, so verse 17, more complaining. The entire Israelite community left the wilderness of Sin, moving from one place to the next according to the Lord's command. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So the people complained to Moses, give us water to drink. Which I love how this is phrased there, right? Because what do they think Moses is going to do? We talked a few weeks ago about the numbers question, right? Like, were there multiple millions of Israelites, or were there a few thousand? And we talked about how different people come at it from different points of view, and they'll have different answers to that question. One way or another, though, Moses doesn't have several thousand liters of water, let alone several million liters of water, right? So going to Moses and going, give us water, is very, petty and silly.
Well, I mean, he is the one that has been doing, quote unquote, the stuff.
Right. Well, and that's something that probably we have a better handle on that reading the text than the people who were living the events.
Yeah.
Right? Because we, reading the text, see all of the references to things happening by the agency of God, not Moses. Right? Whereas the people living the text, I don't know necessarily that they would be able to make that distinction very easily.
Yeah.
Right? But his response is also very good. Why are you complaining to me? Moses replied to them. Why are you testing the Lord? And that's an important part of his response, right? Because it gives us an indication of the character of their complaint. It's not just that they're asking for water. It's quite legitimate to ask for water.
Yeah.
What they're doing, though, is they're testing God.
Yeah. And
that's a different thing.
And it's interesting that he was able to recognize that.
Exactly. Right. So that is going to get, by the end of this section, right, that part's going to become clear. But while we start this discussion, it's important to remember that Moses is not just upset because they asked for something legitimately. He's upset because they asked for it in a way that challenges God. Okay. Verse 3, but the people thirsted there for water and grumbled against Moses. They said, why did you ever bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? Right. Just complaining, right? 4, then Moses cried out to the Lord, what should I do with these people? In a little while they will stone me. That's a fairly reasonable conclusion, right? Because if he's the one that they're all looking at, expecting to be responsible for this, then, he's in trouble. The Lord answered Moses, go on ahead of the people and take some of the elders of Israel with you. Now, that phrase, elders of Israel, keep that in the back of your head, right? This is exactly who you think it is. The elders of Israel, the old wise people who everyone goes to when they have issues and questions, right? I'm bringing this up because this is commonly pointed to as, people who want to be critical will say, well, how can those people exist if they weren't appointed until chapter 18? Well, 2 reasons. Number 1, the group appointed in chapter 18 is not called elders. And number 2, where does it say that the events of chapter 18 must necessarily come after the events of chapter 17? Right?
Because they go 17, 18?
Right. That's us demanding that this be written as a historical account, not understanding that maybe this was grouped this way because the complaining and grumbling of the Israelites about food and meat and water sort of goes together, right? And we don't necessarily know the precise timing of the stuff that happened in chapter 18. So the timing of those 2 events isn't mutually exclusive. Whether one happens, that's maybe not the right word, but the text does not demand that these events happen sequentially, for one thing. And for another, the group that's mentioned in chapter 17 is a different group than the one that's appointed in chapter 18. So this is not really a problem. And as we said in reference to a different passage, I don't remember which passage it was, don't let people who are going to be critical no matter what you do or what you say badly define what they are then going to argue with you about, right? There's no reason to allow bad definitions to define how our arguments have to go. Anyway. All right.
You're in the middle of a verse somewhere.
In the middle of verse somewhere. Okay.
5.
The Lord answered Moses, go on ahead of the people and take some of the elders of Israel with you. Take the staff you struck the Nile with in your hand and go. I'm going to stand there in front of you on the rock at Horeb. When you hit the rock, water will come out of it and the people will drink. Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. He named this place Massa and Meribah because the Israelites complained and because they tested the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? Okay. Excuse me. There have been a couple of references that are easy to fly by, right? One specific reference that came earlier was God told Moses, I'm going to send my angel with you, right? And he told him specifically to be very careful about their conduct because he has the power to punish their sin, right? Well, who has the power and authority to punish sin?
Jesus.
God does, right? And then we saw in the burning bush incident, there was the angel of the Lord and the presence of the Lord, both in the same place, like one in the shape of a man and one in the fire or from the fire, right? Okay. So here we have this little thing that's really easy to skip over where it says, I'm going to stand there in front of you on the rock. That sounds suspiciously like the man-shaped version of God, right? The man-shaped presence of God is the one that's being discussed here, right? And I'm bringing this up because, we've talked about this a few other times, but the idea that God as a man is somehow a new invention of the church in the first century is just utterly false. There's numerous instances of God appearing in an anthropomorphic way, right? And when God describes this, he describes this as a person distinct from himself, but still himself. If that makes sense.
No.
It is kind of mysterious, but my point is it happens. It is not a new invention of the New Testament. Anyway, it's not to say that you can argue a Trinity from this passage, but still. All right. And then, of course, that passage ends with the complaint, is the Lord among us or not? Right? And that's kind of the context of the complaining that we started with back in verse 2. Right? That kind of neatly wraps up the character of the complaint. It wasn't just, gee, Moses, we're really thirsty. It was, gee, Moses, we're really thirsty. I thought you said God was with us. I guess you were lying. Right? It's much more petty than we might assume if we're not seeing that context. Okay. 8. At Rephidim, Amalek came and fought against Israel. Now we're going to take a little moment here and talk about Amalek and figure out who this guy is. There are lots of references to Amalek or Amalekites in the Old Testament. And other than like one that I can think of, they're all referencing Amalek and the Amalekites as enemies, bitter enemies, right? So Amalek, the guy, the singular Amalek, was the grandson of Esau, who was, of course, Jacob's brother, right? And he is mentioned in Genesis 36, verses 12 and verses 16, right? And 16 has him as a chief, one of the chiefs that descends from Eliphaz, who is the son of Esau, or one of the sons of Esau. So he becomes the head of a tribe, and then a people descend from him, right? And the way this is described in Exodus kind of expects you to know something about Amalek, right? Because it gives you absolutely no backstory whatsoever. We've not seen Amalek pop up or the Amalekites in Exodus at all. They simply haven't been mentioned one way or another. So all of a sudden they pop up, and a very reasonable question is, who the heck is this guy? Why is he fighting with them? What's the beef, right? Why are they upset? So you get a little bit of backstory, or maybe some explanation of the backstory, in Deuteronomy chapter 25. So Deuteronomy is, of course, a retelling, right? A rehash of the events of the Exodus, and it kind of theologizes some events, right? Oh, there's a fly flying in my face. It theologizes some of the explanations for events, which is nice because it gives you a way to interpret what those events were intended to communicate, but it also gives you a few more details in some places. So, Deuteronomy 25, verse 17 has this. Remember what the Amalekites did. That fly is not leaving me alone. Remember what the Amalekites did to you on the journey after you left Egypt. So that's the period we're talking about now. They met you along the way and attacked all your stragglers from behind when you were tired and weary. They did not fear God. When the Lord your God gives you rest from all the enemies around you in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess as an inheritance, blot out the memory of Amalek under heaven. Do not forget. So, in other words, this is an enemy that preyed on the weakest and most vulnerable people in Israel, in that group of people that was traveling through the desert, right? So we're told flat out they are villainous.
Mhm.
Okay. Even though, if you think about it, as descendants of Esau, shouldn't they see Israel as like their cousins?
Mhm.
I mean, they're kind of related, aren't they? So that's one factor. It's kind of like not just were they enemies, but they're enemies who should have been, at the very least, neutral, if not friends, because of their relation back to Abraham. Back to Isaac and then Abraham. But that's one facet. It's kind of a betrayal thing going on there. The other thing that's said about the Amalekites is in Numbers 13. So Numbers 13 is it's the passage about what happens when the spies that the Israelites had sent into the promised land came back and reported what they saw, right? So this is kind of a watershed moment, because before this moment, the Israelites were on the way to go enter into the promised land, right? But their spies come back and they're terrified by what they see. So they come back and they give a bad report and say, oh, this is terrible, we can't do this. And the people all say, well, we can't do this, God won't be enough. And God goes, time out. I'm going to wait till this generation dies, and I'm going to bring their children into the promised land. You people don't get to go, right? So it's kind of a big deal in their history.
Mhm.
So in Numbers 13, I'll start at Numbers 13, verse 26. The men went back to Moses, Aaron, and the entire Israelite community in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back a report for them and the whole community, and they showed them the fruit of the land, because it was definitely a fertile place, right?
Mhm.
They were going there because it was it was described as the land flowing with milk and honey.
Mhm.
They reported to Moses, we went into the land where you sent us. Indeed, it is flowing with milk and honey, and here is some of its fruit. However, the people living in the land are strong, and the cities are large and fortified. We also saw the descendants of Anak there. Who are the descendants of Anak?
I don't remember what about you're about to tell me.
Actually, that'll get answered later. Now, depending on how your Bible handles verses 28 and 29, that sentence either ends with a period or a semicolon.
Mine has a period.
Okay? It's important to remember that in the original text, in Old Hebrew, there are no punctuation marks,
Mhm.
right? Punctuation is something that's kind of foreign to these languages,
Mhm.
right? And even today, like in Arabic is of course not Hebrew, but it's similar in a lot of ways. And even today, if you try to apply Western punctuation rules to Arabic, the result is usually that you're confused, right? So let's read how this goes. We saw also the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites are living in the land of the Negev. The Hittites, the Hethites, the Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live by the sea along the Jordan. Okay, so that set of people that was just described there, the implication in this passage is that those are the descendants of Anak,
Mhm.
right? Because otherwise, why are you talking about them? It's a completely contextless statement to make if there's no connection between that list of peoples, right, and the sentence that comes just before.
Mhm.
So it's probably actually best to see that period as a semicolon, where it would read, we saw also, or I'm sorry, where it would be implied, we saw also the descendants of Anak there, which are the Amalekites who are living in the land of the Negev, the Hittites, the Jebusites and Amorites that live in the hill country, and the Canaanites that live by the sea along the Jordan, right? So the important thing for us to understand when we're looking at this passage is that the Amalekites are associated with the sons of Anak, right? That's how the people reading this are going to understand it. Knowing that, actually, let's just move on a little bit. Numbers 13, verse 30. Then Caleb quieted the people in the presence of Moses and said, let's go up now and take possession of the land, because we can certainly conquer it. Caleb is a good guy, so he's thinking, so? Who cares if they're descended from Anak, right? Don't we have God? But the men who had gone up with him responded, we can't attack the people because they are stronger than we are. Well, yeah, but are they stronger than God? Anyway, that's going to have to wait for when we get into Numbers. So they gave a negative report to the Israelites about the land that they had scouted. The land we passed through to explore is one that devours its inhabitants, and all the people we saw in it are men of great size. We even saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. To ourselves we seemed like grasshoppers, and we must have seemed the same to them. Aha! So now we know who the sons of Anak are, right? So the sons of Anak are descended from the Nephilim, and of course they're abnormally large. There's some debate, which we aren't really going to get into all that, about exactly how large, because some people take this entirely the wrong way.
20 feet tall.
Yeah. It makes me sad sometimes, because there's some people who look at other texts and come up with just impossible, like hundreds of feet tall, which is absurd, totally absurd, right? Mm-hmm. Anyway, we're not going to go into all that. Point is, the Amalekites are related to the sons of Anak, or the Anakim, depending on your translation, who are related to the Nephilim. Well, who are the Nephilim?
I don't remember.
You don't remember? Okay. The Nephilim, I said we were going to do a lot of jumping around. The Nephilim are mentioned in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. So this is a nice, quick reference. So Genesis 6, verse 1. I have to wait for you. Okay.
Okay.
Genesis 6, verse 1. When mankind began to multiply on the earth and daughters were born to them, remember this is like post-Adam and Eve, pre-flood, right? The sons of God saw that the daughters of mankind were beautiful, and they took any they chose as wives for themselves. So daughters of mankind makes perfect sense. That's exactly what it sounds like. Sons of God is Old Testament language for divine beings, right? This is well understood language. Some people will try to jump through their butt and make this into some other group, but those arguments just don't work for a number of reasons that we're not really going to dissect at the moment. But this was widely understood as union between divine beings and human women, right? Okay. And the Lord said, my spirit will not remain with mankind forever because they are corrupt. Their days will be 120 years. So the very next part that happens after this passage of verses 1 through 4 is the declaration of the flood. So this time when there were unions between divine beings and humans that produced offspring is one of the things that precipitates the flood. So this is obviously something that the Old Testament casts as a bad thing, which has a whole lot of baggage associated with it that we'll talk about some other time probably. But verse 4, the Nephilim were on the earth both in those days and afterward, when the sons of God came to the daughters of mankind, who bore children to them. They were powerful men of old, the famous men. Okay, so that's who the Nephilim are. They are the result of this divine and human union. The Anakim are descendants from them, and Numbers 13 identifies the Amalekites as being associated with the Anakim. So, in the mind of the Israelite reader, when they see Amalekites or Amalek, exactly, right? This is definitely a group of people that they look at as enemies, not just political enemies, not just territorial enemies, right? But supernatural enemies who have as their origin and a sort of an abominable, unnatural union that should not have been. That was part of what precipitated the flood, right? So the Israelite reader would see this and go, oh, heck no, right? Like those aren't just enemies, but they're extra bad enemies. But they would also see the spiritual connection there, right? Because why are they strong? This is, Nephilim is an interesting word, and we'll probably talk more about that later. But in Numbers 13, the Amalekites or the Anakim are described as being very big, right? Well, Nephilim was translated in the Septuagint as giants. And of course, that's a word that has some baggage with it, but the word doesn't have to mean unnaturally large, right? A giant could also be somebody who was great, famous, powerful, mighty, right? As they're described at the end of Genesis 4. I mean, the perfect example.
Genesis 4?
Genesis 6, verse 4, I'm sorry. The perfect example for us to understand the idea is to look at a Greek person, a Greek hero named Hercules. He had his very own Disney movie, right? But who was Hercules' father? In Greek mythology, it was Zeus. Was his mother a Greek god, or was it a human woman? Human woman, right? Ooh.
That's not what Disney said.
That's not what Disney said. But if you look at the Greek mythology, that's what he was, right? And that's why Hera was so annoyed, but we're not going to get into too much Greek mythology right now. Point is, Hercules in mythology was strong and powerful and heroic, right? And Greek mythology casts him as this great warrior hero, right? But it doesn't say that he was 20 feet tall.
Yeah.
It doesn't describe him as being, ridiculously tall. It describes him as being probably what you would say, probably a description that would fit with Genesis 6:4, a powerful man of old, a famous man, right? So with that understanding, the Israelite reader would look at this differently. He wouldn't see the Nephilim or the Anakim or the groups associated with them as powerful heroes from a bygone age. He would see them as unnatural, terrible things that resulted in the corruption of the earth. So they would take that idea of unnatural corruption and they would associate it with the Amalekites and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites and the Canaanites. All those groups that are defined in Numbers 13. Make sense? So going back to Exodus 17, the point of all of that is that when Exodus 17 just says, at Rephidim, Amalek came and fought against Israel, there's a lot of baggage associated with that, right? It's not just, oh, some guys showed up and we had to fight them. It's not just, oh, they were pretty villainous and they tried to attack the weak stragglers. It's, oh, these are the groups that represent bad, unnatural corruption on the earth. The enemies of God were the origin of this group. Make sense? So in the same way that the contest between Pharaoh and God was about a spiritual contest, the contest between Israel and Amalek is a spiritual contest. Does that make sense? That's how the text is casting it, right? So let's read on. Verse 9. Huh?
Read on where?
Read on in Exodus 17.
Okay.
Yeah, we're done with the jumping around bit.
Okay. 17.
Exodus 17, verse 9.
Okay.
Moses said to Joshua, select some men for us and go fight against Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the hilltop with God's staff in my hand. Joshua did. Why God's staff? Well, because so far that's been the instrument through which God's power has been demonstrated, right? Joshua did as Moses had told him and fought against Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. While Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. But whenever he put his hand down, Amalek prevailed. When Moses' hands grew heavy, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat down on it. Then Moses and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and one on the other, so that his hands remained steady until the sun went down. So Joshua defeated Amalek and his army with the sword. Okay, so whose power was it that defeated Amalek? It wasn't Moses, because he couldn't stand up the whole time. He couldn't keep his hands up. It wasn't Joshua, right? Because he would have lost, right? Mm-hmm. It was the power of God. That's the point of the staff, right? Mm-hmm. About whenever it's raised, whenever that's, the focus, that's when they're winning, right? So just like the contest between Pharaoh and God was about who was the greater divine personality, and of course Pharaoh wasn't divine at all, it's the same here, right? Are these descendants of quasi-divine corrupt influences greater than God? No, absolutely not, right? Which makes Numbers 13 very ironic, right? Because by the time we get to Numbers 13, they look at the same things, right?
Sorry, what was 13 again?
Numbers 13 was we can't fight them, they're stronger than us.
Oh, that's right.
Numbers 13 is when they look at the same battle, or the same kind of battle that God had already won for them, and say, we can't possibly fight it. And that's when God pulls the plug and says, all right, I'm done with you guys. It's your descendants that are going in, but not you, right? Because that wasn't just saying, hey, we're scared. That was saying, God can't possibly win. Mm-hmm. Well, that's what just happened, right? Okay. Exodus 17, verse 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, write this down on a scroll as a reminder and recite it to Joshua. I will completely blot out the memory of Amalek under heaven. Hey, that's actually that's kind of repeated in Deuteronomy 25, remember? And Moses built an altar and named it, The Lord is my banner. He said, indeed, my hand is lifted up toward the Lord's throne. The Lord will be at war with Amalek from generation to generation. Now, there's some different translations of that. Some translations go with a hand against the throne, right? But either way,
or hand this one.
Right. Either way, I think you end up in a correct place, mm-hmm. right? Because the way we have it translated here, this is talking about this translation has the Lord is my banner and my hand is lifted up towards the Lord's throne. In essence, giving credit for the victory to God, right? Mm-hmm. The hand against the Lord translators usually try to apply that back to Amalek, saying God's hand was raised against Amalek. And the hand on the throne kind of splits the middle, right? But whether you go with the Lord is my banner idea or Amalek was against God, you're still ending up with this was a conflict that has a supernatural level to it, where God was the victor ultimately, and the Israelites won because God enabled them to win, right? And one way or another, that's where we're supposed to end up in interpreting this passage. Okay. Chapter 18. This is going to be much more straightforward in comparison. Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. The one thing I'll say about Jethro is that in different passages, he's given different names. Some people speculate that some of those names are actually titles rather than personal names, but it doesn't really need to be much more said about that. He's Moses' father-in-law, we already know that, and he's the priest of Midian. We know that. Okay, Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, heard about everything that God had done for Moses and his people Israel, and how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Now, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, had taken in Zipporah, Moses' wife, after she had after he had sent her back, along with her 2 sons, one of whom was named Gershom, because Moses had said, I have been a foreigner in a foreign land, and the other Eleazar, because he had said, the God of my father was my helper and delivered me from Pharaoh's sword. Just a slight flashback. This was the event that happened with the whole bridegroom of blood incident.
Mhm.
So after Moses had the encounter with God at the burning bush, and after his brother Aaron came to meet them, they had that whole bridegroom of blood thing. And for whatever reason, Moses decides to send his wife and kids back to his father-in-law to stay with them, probably because he realizes that he's about to do something that's incredibly dangerous. So that's reasonable. So Moses,
Yeah,
verse 5, yeah. Okay. Moses' father-in-law Jethro, along with Moses' wife and sons, came to him in the wilderness, where he was camped at the mountain of God. He sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons. So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, bowed down, and then kissed him. They asked each other how they had been and went into the tent. This is a very Middle Eastern greeting.
Although I do have to say, it's very interesting that they were like, and her 2 sons, rather than just like, hey, here's your wife and kids.
Yeah. So I suspect that, like, by the end of this chapter, Moses' wife Zipporah is going to continue living with his father-in-law, right? And I suspect that the point of that is Moses is leading a new nation that's associated with the covenant, and specifically with the offspring of Jacob, right? Zipporah is a Midianite. So I suspect that the separation between those two isn't about necessarily they hate each other. It's not a divorce at all, right? But I suspect that it has something to do with wanting to keep clear the idea that Israel was a group that was supposed to be different from the world, was supposed to be separate from the other nations around it, right? There's no indication in the text that there was anything wrong with Zipporah. There's no indication. I mean, she was the one that saved Moses' life with the whole bridegroom of blood thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
She was the one that knew how to do what needed to be done. So there's no indication that there's anything wrong with her. If I'm speculating, I'm thinking that Moses probably said, look, Zipporah, this is something that I'm called to do, and it's probably going to suck because we're going to do war and, bad stuff. Why don't you stay with your dad? And then he ended up wandering in the desert for 40 years.
Yeah.
Right? And she didn't really need to have anything to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Anyway, but like I said, that's speculation.
But it's still just like in her 2 sons as opposed to his sons.
Right.
It's kind of the weird thing.
Yep. All right. 8. Moses recounted to his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardships they had confronted them on the way, and how the Lord delivered them. Jethro rejoiced over all the good things the Lord had done for Israel when he rescued them from the power of the Egyptians. Praise the Lord, Jethro exclaimed, who rescued you from Pharaoh and the power of the Egyptians, and snatched the people from the power of the Egyptians. Now I know that Yahweh is greater than all the gods, because he did wonders when the Egyptians acted arrogantly against Israel. So Jethro gets it, right? He very clearly sees that the contest was between God and Pharaoh, and the gods of Egypt versus Yahweh. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel, remember this group again, to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law in God's presence. The next day, Moses sat down to judge the people, and they stood around Moses from morning till evening. When Moses' father-in-law saw everything he was doing for them, he asked, "What is this thing you're doing for the people? Why are you alone, sitting as judge, while all the people stand around you from morning until evening?" Moses replied to his father-in-law, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. Whenever they have a dispute, it comes to me, and I make a decision between one man and another. I teach them God's statutes and laws. What you are doing is not good, Moses' father-in-law said to him. You will surely wear out both yourself and these people who are with you. Because the task is too heavy for you, you can't do it alone. Now listen to me. I will give you some advice, and God be with you. You are the one to represent the people before God and bring their cases to him. This makes perfect sense. Instruct them about the statutes and laws and teach them the way to live and what they must do. Right? Okay. Makes perfect sense, right?
Mhm.
But you should select from among the people able men, God-fearing, trustworthy, and hating bribes. Place them over the people as commanders of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. They should judge the people at all times. They can bring you every important case, but judge every minor case themselves. In this way, you will lighten your load, and they will bear it with you. If you do this, and God so directs you, you will be able to endure, and all these people will be able to go home satisfied. So this is just good leadership thinking, right? Moses was trying to control way too much stuff personally that just didn't need to happen that way. I also am kind of amused by this as an indication of how none of their successes so far were due to Moses' leadership, because his leadership skills are terrible,
Mhm.
right? He really, really, really needs to delegate.
Mhm.
And Jethro tells him, dude, you got to delegate. Yeah, do the important stuff, do the big stuff, right? Represent the people before God and teach them what God needs to teach them. But delegate the other stuff, man.
I think the other thing that I like about that is somewhere 20 something. But where he talks about like if God is willing. So he's not saying like, hey, I know this is really great advice, just go ahead and do it.
Right.
19, I think.
22, if you do this and God so directs you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of interesting because Jethro's just now like going, hey, this Yahweh, this God guy is like the real deal, is the woo.
Mhm.
And, you know, I'm sure Jethro like was kind of like Moses-ish for like his group, that he was leading a bunch of people kind of thing.
He's the leader of a clan, yeah. A clan
So-
or a tribe or something
So
like that.
he's got all this experience
Mhm.
and is like, I know what I'm talking about. And he's
Yeah.
still like, hey, I know what I'm talking about, but I'm also going to be really humble about it, and you should still make sure God's okay with it.
Yeah, Jethro is really good at his job, right? But you're right. It is important that Jethro does point out God needs to be on board with this, right?
Mhm.
I also find it interesting that Jethro points out, and the people will be able to go home satisfied.
Mhm.
Because imagine if you stood around from morning until, night, waiting to get a chance for Moses to hear your case, and then you didn't get it.
So then you basically have to wait.
Yes. That would be terrible.
It's like the longest queue in the world.
Right. It's terrible. It's the worst form of governance you can think of, right?
We've all been to Dragon.
Yeah.
Well, maybe not all, but
So, nothing about God choosing Moses to be his representative for the people demands that Moses' leadership be bad. Or demands that Moses doesn't delegate anything, or demands that Moses maintain absolute control over every decision.
Mhm.
Right? That's absurd.
it's almost like God kind of gave us the free will to sort of think, not literally delegate everything we should do.
Right. And this is, we don't have this problem in our context because we're a house church, right? But there are places where, and I totally don't agree with this, where people think that their pastor of their church has to be the one who accepts or rejects every single decision that they make.
Mhm.
Right? They give that guy not only spiritual authority, but day-to-day authority to say, no, you shouldn't do that.
Mhm.
Right? As if people can't develop wisdom for themselves.
Mhm.
But aside from the fact that it's too much work for any one person to lead a large group without delegating, it's also too much power.
Yep.
You know,
which we'll see later.
Yeah.
Spoilers.
24. Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. So Moses chose able men from all Israel and made them leaders over the people as commanders of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. They judged the people at all times. They would bring the hard cases to Moses, but they would judge every minor case themselves. Then Moses said goodbye to his father-in-law and journeyed to his own land. And he journeyed to his own land. Okay.
But it does mention somewhere that Moses' wife and kids leave.
I don't remember where that is.
Okay. Just because at this point, it's not saying anything, so
right.
I would just assume wife and kids stayed.
Right. But it's also kind of not the point of any of the passages, so it's something that's just not going to get much text time. The one thing that I wanted to point out about how that all resolves is, remember what I said earlier when we were looking at 17 and the elders of Israel, and we said that's not the same group that gets appointed in 18. So this is a very common bad argument that people make to be critical of Exodus, to say, well, all those pre-18 references to the elders of Israel don't make any sense because that group didn't exist until Exodus 18. Well, that's dumb, because this group is never called the elders of Israel in Exodus 18.
Yeah.
Right? They're called leaders or commanders or judges or something like that. Right? So we're not going to get into a thing about the governance of Israel and the different forms of governing bodies.
Well, honestly, even when I saw that, because Jethro mentions, like, hey, take people, teach them, instruct them, and then they go do their thing. Whereas in 17, the elders are what they are. Like, they're just going to be smart old people that do the thing.
Right.
And then later you bring up younger people who can be taught and then can...
Right. I mean, they're just two totally different groups. Because, as you said, the elders are exactly what they sound like. They're the family heads, right? The elders of Israel as a group predate Moses. Because Israel, right, the descendants of Jacob, who was named Israel, had been in Egypt for some 400 years-ish, right? So the family heads had always been the family heads. That group didn't change. All that happened was judges or leaders or commanders were delegated some authority for governance tasks, right? There's no conflict here, either textually or historically or anything else. But nevertheless, it is something that sometimes people point at and complain about, but it's a pretty dumb complaint because...
I don't think elders in this context want to really have a job, because their life has already been hard enough all along. So,
yeah,
I imagine they don't mind giving people wisdom.
Well,
and putting somebody under their wings.
Yeah, and
having to take care of that many people.
Later on, the difference between elders and judges continues to stay, right? So there's a whole book about judges who were
called judges.
Yeah, I mean, they're never called elders, they're called judges, but they're the leadership figures, right? Who are concerned with justice and security and stuff like that, right? The elders continue to function as a political body that represents the people of Israel. So when you get to the monarchy, the elders of Israel are the group that wields sort of political power for if the monarchs want the people of Israel to support them. But the judges are still the ones that are deciding cases, right? That are applying the rule of law and applying wisdom and stuff like that, right? So they continue to have separated jobs later on in the Old Testament. Anyway, I think we're about done for tonight.
We have many things to pray for.
Yeah,
Will remain unnamed on the interwebs, but
yeah.
Yeah.
I'll pray right quick and then we'll be done. Father, thank you for your wisdom and your authority and your power in dealing with things that are beyond our capability and capacity. We trust in your wisdom and providence to handle things that are outside of our spheres of influence and control. And we trust that you will keep us safe and prosperous and productive as we continue to focus on following you and being a good influence in the world in your name. In Jesus' name, amen.
bye, Dad.
Hey, Jim. Good night. Bye.
Bye.